Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some fascinating history and philosophy.
Always, especially when it comes to impactful figures like the one we're exploring today.
That's right. Today, we're looking into the ideas of Marcus Garvey. We've got some excerpts you shared with us from Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey.
A great collection.
It is. It's full of his speeches and writings, all edited by Amy Jacques Garvey.
And dedicated, of course, to the members of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Can't forget that.
Absolutely. And to think this book emerged when racial oppression was so intense really gives you a sense of the context.
For sure. Limited opportunities for Black people globally. It was a different world.
So Garvey steps into this world with some pretty powerful and often controversial ideas.
Definitely. He wasn't afraid to shake things up. A real advocate for Black self-reliance, racial pride, and that big one, the return to Africa.
That's what makes him so interesting to study. Now, one thing that really struck me reading through this was how Garvey redefined such basic concepts. Take history, for example. Well, he doesn't see it as just a record of the past, but as a guide for the future, almost like what we do today. Well, it directly shapes the destiny of, our race tomorrow. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a great point. You can really see Garvey's emphasis on agency and responsibility there.
Yeah.
He wasn't one to just sit back and lament injustices. No, he wanted action.
Yeah.
He wanted to inspire Black people to take control, own their narrative.
It's really interesting because he does the same thing with ambition, too. It's not just personal success, but this driving force for the entire race to strive for something bigger, to achieve greatness.
Absolutely. And he connects that ambition straight to power, his argument. A race without power is a race without respect. Pretty bold statement for the time.
Oh, definitely bold. He wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking, like his stance on philanthropy, for example.
Right. He believed that true liberation couldn't come from relying on others' charity. Instead, he urged Black people to build their own everything, their own industries, governments. He even talked about empires.
Wow. He really pushed for complete self-reliance. And when you think about it, that really resonates with the ideas we see later in the 20th century, with movements like Black nationalism and economic empowerment.
For sure, there's a clear through line there. But it's not just about building up material power. Garvey goes deeper, critiquing the leadership of his time.
Yeah, he even labels some as traitors, right? Those who he felt put personal gain ahead of the advancement of their race.
A pretty strong statement, for sure. Makes you think about what truly defines leadership. Garvey believed it was about prioritizing the collective good, putting the needs of the many above your own, even if that meant challenging the status quo.
And risking personal sacrifice, too. Because he definitely faced his share of risks, accusations, legal actions, all because he dared to challenge the power structure of his time. And yet, it's like he welcomed those challenges.
That's interesting. Why do you think that was?
Well, it seemed like he almost saw it as proof he was hitting a nerve, that his message was potent enough to threaten those in power. That's a lot of courage.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about his conviction. And this conviction really shines through in his critique of present-day civilization, as he called it.
Oh, yeah, he doesn't hold back there, calling it morally corrupt and, pretty much headed for destruction. It's a bold critique.
It is.
Yeah.
But it's not just a critique, right? He offers a different path. He believed that Africa rightfully belonged to Black people and that a free and redeemed Africa could protect Black people all over the world. It reminds me of the Pan-Africanist movements that were growing at the time.
Oh, I see the connection. And it was such a powerful idea. Now, one area I struggled with a bit was Garvey's views on race, specifically his rejection of what he called miscegenation, the mixing of races, and this concept of a pure Black race. It's something we have to approach carefully, wouldn't you say?
Well, absolutely. It's essential to understand these ideas within the historical context.
Hmm.
We're talking about the early 20th century, a time when racial purity theories were, well, unfortunately, they were pretty common. We can't ignore the potential harm in such ideas, but we also have to consider the social and political dynamics of the time.
Yeah, Blackness was constantly being devalued, so in a way, you can see how he might have seen racial purity as a way to reclaim pride and dignity for his people.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even well-intentioned individuals can have views that we now understand to be flawed.
And it highlights how important it is to engage with the full complexity of historical figures, both the good and the more challenging aspects.
I completely agree. We can't just pick and choose what parts of history we want to acknowledge.
And speaking of complexity, Garvey's thoughts on religion were pretty fascinating too. Like, he acknowledged the huge variety of religions and interpretations, even within Christianity.
right? He saw it fracturing into all these different faiths. And he even applies this idea to prohibition. He's not just talking about alcohol. He argues that we experience a kind of daily drunkenness through natural things like eating and breathing.
It's like he's always pushing the boundaries of how we think about things.
Definitely.
Yeah.
He saw the world operating on this bluff, where no one race or nation has some divine right to exploit others. And this really ties into his idea of self-reliance.
How so?
Well, if no one has this inherent right to rule, then waiting around for others to grant you equality is pointless. You have to build it yourself.
So action, creating your own destiny, that seems like a big theme in his philosophy. Then he carries that into his views on education, too.
Right, he wasn't just talking about book smarts. He wanted a deeper kind of knowledge, the kind that helps you understand yourself, other people, even your relationship with a higher power.
So what was the purpose of that kind of education in Garvey's view?
He saw it as crucial for building a unique civilization, one created by Black people for Black people. He wanted to go beyond just fitting into existing systems. He wanted to create new ones.
That's ambitious. And it connects so well with his definition of death, too. He saw it as a transformation, not an end, particularly for those who lived righteously. It's like for them, death was stepping into immortality, a higher plane of existence. It's a very powerful concept.
Absolutely. It reflects his deep spirituality, his belief that a life dedicated to a higher purpose leaves a lasting legacy. And it ties into his idea of faithfulness, too.
What did he mean by that?
To Garvey, faithfulness was unwavering commitment. No doubts, no regrets. You serve, you keep your promises, you do your duty with complete dedication. He really lived by those principles, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. He never backed down from what he believed in, even when things got tough. And he was very direct about the reality of racial prejudice, arguing it stemmed not just from skin color, but from the perception that, well, that Black people hadn't achieved anything significant as a race.
Yeah, that's a tough assessment to hear. But it reveals his belief in the power of collective achievement to overcome prejudice. He wasn't about dwelling on victimhood. He wanted action, results.
It's clear he believed in leading by example. Now, before we move on, I'm curious, what stands out to you most about Garvey's philosophy from what we've discussed so far? What are your initial impressions?
Honestly, it's his commitment to action that's so striking. He didn't just talk about the problems facing Black people, he offered solutions. Real, concrete solutions.
Yeah, like his famous declaration, Africa for the Africans. It wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a call to action, a way to reclaim their homeland and build a nation strong enough to protect their own interests.
Exactly. He saw what was happening globally, the political shifts, and he saw an opportunity. But there's also this more, challenging aspect to his thinking, his perspective on force, even violence.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I wrestled with too. He argued that power, even destructive power, could be necessary for a race to protect itself. He even suggested that some might have to, well, die for the cause of African redemption. It's hard to reconcile that with, his message of peace and unity.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah.
Garvey was a complex figure. He recognized the world wasn't always a peaceful place. There were power struggles, sometimes violent ones. He saw it as a tragic, but in some cases, necessary part of achieving liberation.
So while he advocated for peace, he also acknowledged that sometimes you have to fight for it.
Right, it's a nuanced view of resistance, for sure. And you see that same nuance in his views on women, too. He talks about their complexity, the ever-changing dynamics in relationships. He even compares the changes women bring to the shifts between day and night. It suggests a real appreciation for their role in society, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely challenges some of the traditional views of his time that, well, that often put women in a secondary position.
And this complexity pops up again in his definition of love. He calls it a happy but miserable state.
Happy but miserable. That's interesting.
Right. It's full of joy and sweetness, but he sees it as ultimately fleeting.
Hmm.
He contrasts this temporary human love with the unchanging love of God. It's a fascinating exploration of the different facets of love.
It's like he's saying that even in something as powerful as love, there's this need for balance. You recognize the beauty, but also the limitations.
Definitely.
And speaking of powerful, let's talk about his speeches. Garvey was an incredible orator. His words really painted a picture. He used such vivid imagery and historical
Oh,
examples.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Like in that famous speech at Liberty Hall in New York City, he drew these parallels between African liberation and, get this, the American Revolution.
Wow, really?
Yeah, he talked about revolutionaries like George Washington, reminding everyone that even ordinary people can achieve incredible things when they're united by a common goal.
He was really good at drawing inspiration from different struggles for freedom.
He was. He also talked about the Irish, emphasizing how much the Negro race could learn from their struggles too, their resilience, their determination. And his Easter Sunday sermon, well, that one really gets you. He uses the resurrection of Jesus as this metaphor for the resurrection of black people.
I remember that. He urges his listeners to awaken from the slumber of the ages and embrace this new life, full of self-awareness and, well, empowerment. It's such a powerful call to action.
It really is. Even in the phase of, death and oppression, there's always that possibility of rebirth, of renewal. His speeches are full of lines that stick with you, even today.
Oh, yeah, like when he declared that for the past 500 years, there'd never been a real attempt to free Negroes.
A powerful statement, right? He was pointing out that true freedom goes beyond just legal pronouncements. You need economic independence, political power, a sense of self-worth.
It's not just about being given rights, it's about having the ability to exercise those rights.
Exactly. And there's another line from that speech I love. He says, as Christ triumphed nearly 2,000 years ago over death and the grave, as he was risen from the dead, so do I hope that 400,000 Negroes of today will triumph over the slavishness of the past.
Wow, that's powerful. You
Yeah.
can really see why his message resonated so deeply, not just with African Americans, but with Black people all over the world.
He had a way of connecting those spiritual themes to the social and political realities of the time.
It wasn't just his speeches either. His writing was just as potent. In Philosophy and Opinions, he really dives into complex topics: propaganda, slavery, even the role of government.
He breaks them down, exposes how they impact the lives of black people. Like take his analysis of slavery, for example.
Oh, yeah. What was his take on that?
Well, he saw it as a condition that's imposed on those who are too weak to protect themselves. And he made it clear that it wasn't limited to any particular race or time period.
So he was basically redefining slavery, saying it wasn't inherently about race, but about power, whoever's strong exploiting the weak.
Exactly. He used the example of the British, how they were once enslaved by the Romans, to show how a race's status can change over time. It challenges that idea of racial hierarchy as being fixed and unchangeable.
It's amazing how forward-thinking he was. And he was equally critical of the press, saying their true function is to serve the public without bias, to convey the truth. That's a high standard for any media outlet.
It really shows how much he valued truth and how much he believed in the power of unbiased information. Now, his definition of miscegenation is it's something else. He believed that the mixing of races perpetuated this curse brought about by slavery.
That's a tough concept to grapple with, for sure.
It is. It's crucial to understand it within the context of those early 20th century racial purity theories. We know how harmful those theories can be, but they were widespread during his time.
So he was operating in a very different world.
Exactly. And you have to remember, blackness was constantly being devalued. He saw racial purity as a way to reclaim that sense of pride, that dignity. It was a way of pushing back against a system designed to erase black identity.
So while we recognize those flaws today, we can at least try to understand how those views arose, from that desire to uplift and empower Black people in a society that was constantly pushing them down.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even brilliant minds can hold beliefs that are later understood to be harmful.
It's a reminder that we're always learning, always evolving, and that's why it's so important to engage with these historical figures, to see their strengths, their weaknesses, their complexities.
Absolutely. We can't just erase the parts that make us uncomfortable.
Now, Garvey faced a lot of opposition in his lifetime. He was even arrested back in 1922, and in a speech he gave after his arrest, he compared himself to all these other reformers throughout history who also faced opposition, often from their own people.
He saw a pattern there, didn't he?
He did. He argued that his message, his focus on self-reliance and racial pride, it threatened the status quo. It angered those who benefited from keeping Black people divided and dependent.
Makes you wonder, who were those people who felt so threatened?
Right. He even compared his own persecution to the persecution of Jesus.
Whoa, that's a strong comparison.
It is. He was basically suggesting that anyone who challenges the established order, well, they're going to face accusations, attempts to discredit their work. It comes with the
He
territory.
was willing to pay that price, though.
And in that same speech, he makes this powerful declaration. He says, Jews, Irish, and reformers of all races have had their troubles and trials with their own people, so I am satisfied to bear the persecution of my own that they might be free.
He knew what he was getting into. He was prepared to endure hardship for the sake of his cause.
And he ends that speech with a message of unity, purpose. He even quotes the preamble of his organization's constitution. He says, the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League is a social, friendly, humanitarian, charitable, educational, institutional, constructive, and expansive society, and is founded by persons desiring to the utmost to work for the general uplift of the Negro peoples of the world.
Wow, that's quite a mouthful.
It is, but it gets his point across, you know? He emphasizes that his organization, it's about respecting everyone's rights, believing in the brotherhood of man, the fatherhood of God.
He wasn't about excluding others. He was about uplifting his own people.
Exactly. And his closing words were even more powerful. He echoed his organization's motto, one God, one aim, one destiny. It's a really strong reminder of what his movement stood for, that unity, self-reliance, this belief in a shared destiny for Black people everywhere.
A powerful message.
So as we keep exploring Garvey's philosophy, I think it's important to remember the historical context. But it's also crucial to see how his ideas continue to influence these conversations we're having today about race, about identity, about social justice.
Couldn't agree more. His legacy is definitely complex. But there's no denying he was one of the most influential figures of the 20th century.
His ideas challenged and continue to challenge us to really confront the realities of racism, of colonialism. But he also offered this vision of a future where Black people could be empowered, proud masters of their own destiny. You know, as we've been talking about Garvey, what really strikes me is that emphasis on carving your own path, that need for Black people to become self-reliant, to demand respect. It was a bold message, especially at a time when so many were preaching patience.
It was radical for sure, this vision of empowerment, of urgency. And what's so interesting is he didn't just talk about it, he actually laid out a plan.
You're talking about the UNIA, right, the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
Exactly. It wasn't just a political organization, it was cultural, economic, this force for change. They had businesses, newspapers, even a shipping line, all aimed at fostering Black self-sufficiency and pride.
Wow, a shipping line. That's incredible. It really shows you how big his vision was.
You got it. True liberation takes more than just laws changing. It needs a fundamental shift in how people see themselves.
And he was a master of using symbols to drive that message home, like the UNIA flag with the red, black, and green. It became such a powerful symbol of Black liberation, that unity.
It's iconic. And those colors weren't chosen randomly. Red for the blood, black for the skin, green for the land of Africa. They embody the whole movement, the sacrifice, the racial pride, that desire to return to the homeland.
It's a powerful image, but as you can imagine, a message like Garvey's, it wasn't always welcomed with open arms, was it?
Not by everyone, that's for sure, especially those in power.
He was accused of being divisive, inciting hatred, even though he always maintained that his goal was to uplift Black people, not tear others down.
It's a familiar story, sadly. When someone's message threatens the status quo, well, they try to discredit the messenger.
And they didn't just try to discredit him, did they? The U.S. government actually went after him. He faced charges related to mail fraud, I believe it was. And a lot of people think those charges were politically motivated, a way to silence him, to break up the UNIA.
It's a reminder that fighting for justice, it's rarely easy. There are always obstacles. Those who challenge the system, well, they often pay a price.
And Garvey definitely paid a price. But through it all, he never wavered in his beliefs. If anything, it just strengthened his resolve.
It's like he saw that persecution as proof he was making a difference, shaking things up.
It definitely got people's attention. And it's important to remember, Garvey wasn't just reacting to oppression. He was proposing something new, something positive. A vision for the future, a future where Black people could achieve great things, where Africa could become this beacon of civilization.
It was a bold vision, for sure.
He urged Black people to embrace their heritage, to cultivate their talents, to strive for excellence. It wasn't about being a victim. It was about empowerment, taking control of your own destiny, building a future where you could live with dignity and respect.
And his impact was undeniable. His message resonated with millions of Black people all over the world. It awakened that sense of pride, that desire for self-determination.
He really laid the groundwork for future generations of activists and leaders.
No doubt about it.
Even though that vision of a united and powerful Africa hasn't been fully realized, his message of Black pride, of self-determination, well, it continues to inspire, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It helped shape the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s, and it's still relevant in today's conversations about race, identity, social justice.
It's amazing how much his work from a century ago still speaks to us today.
It really is. Like his emphasis on economic empowerment, we see that in movements like Black Wall Street, right?
Yeah.
And his call for self-determination, well, that echoes in the calls for reparations, for Black political representation.
It's a testament to the power of his ideas, how one person can really make a difference.
No doubt about it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Marcus Garvey, I want to leave you with this. How do you see his ideas impacting the conversations we're having today about race, about identity, about social justice? How can we apply that message of self-reliance and empowerment to the challenges facing Black communities right now? It's something to think about as we continue to confront the legacy of colonialism, of racism, and that ongoing fight for equality.
It's a conversation that needs to continue for sure.
Well, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this remarkable man and the impact he had and continues to have on the world. Thanks for joining us.